This session, configuring and managing enterprise search, is had a number of incarnations over the last few days. And just to let you know, the kind of content we're going to be covering in here is going to be the configuration, administration to a certain degree of the central administration pieces, the user profile, the user search pieces in terms of social search, looking at the search interface from end user perspective, and moving on to things like high availability, capacity planning, performance metrics, some statistics and things you need to think about when you're deploying search. So just a show of hands, was anyone in the IT pro session just before this with Mike Watson? Okay. How much high availability and scale out of search did he show? A little bit? Okay, cool. Right, okay, I just was very wary that I might spend about 15 minutes just duplicating content. So just so you know who I am, I'm manager Hodgkinson. I'm a field engineer at Microsoft, and I'm an instructor on the SharePoint 2010 MCM program for enterprise search. And my details are here if you need to tweet me or email me if you've got any questions after the session, or feel free to come up and have a chat about it, about any content you see. What we're going to look at is very briefly, going with the theme of the whole kind of conference, is the evolution of SharePoint Search, very, very briefly. So just a few examples and some kind of blasts from the past of things you may have seen if you've been around enterprise search or what was nominally called enterprise search, going back a few years. And then we'll look at, as I've said already, the search features from the end user perspective, some things about the goals of the search team. So with SharePoint 2010, there's been some dramatic changes in the way we do search, both from an architectural perspective and from the concept of the content that we actually index and where that content comes from. So we'll talk about what some of the goals and some of the aims of the team and the aims for this version of the product. As I said already, we'll look at scale out and redundancy. And since Mike didn't cover a great deal on there, I do want to cover quite a lot there. And during that particular part of the session, if anyone's got any questions, just fire them out, because it is quite a complex scenario now, dramatically different to what we had in 2007. We'll then look at some aspects of deployment and manageability, more from the how do we install it, what do we need to think about when we're installing it, how do we configure it after we've installed it, a little bit on backup and restore, and then search admin. And there'll be 3 demos. Demo will be simply an end user demo, people search demo, and an administrative demo. What I will try and do, if we have more time at the end as well, I've got an access link to an internal demo at Microsoft, which can show some of the more advanced social search pieces, like nickname searching and phonetic name matching, which don't actually work on my VM, but we'll try and cover that as well. So going forward, search evolution, like I said, handing with the theme from yesterday, not really a search engine at all, and the search capabilities in there were very, very poor, to say the least. I've deliberately omitted SharePoint 2003. Did anybody enjoy searching SharePoint 2003? No, sniggers, okay. SharePoint Server 2007 was kind of the real first attempt that Microsoft made, I think, apart from Site Server, anyone kind of played with Site Server, to really build enterprise search into the product. And it met with a degree of success. Does anyone recognize this? 1 person, 2 people. What is it? What search appliance is it? It's a Microsoft search appliance, which doesn't exist. This was a search appliance that was generated when we released the infrastructure updates. It was created by a vendor hosting the platform, which became Search Server Express. And they were quite surprised none of you had seen it, because there was a lot of press about it at the time when it was first kind of, hey, look what we're doing here, this is really cool. It never really took off. That's probably testament to the fact that none of you have ever seen it before. Just to let you know, that thing did exist at one point. You could buy it, albeit from a vendor. And then the final piece, from a search evolution perspective, is where we are today. In the fact that we have this concept of search within the wheel, as we call it, what are the $1 million slide wheel. And the whole concept of SharePoint search is really driven now around finding people, finding content. One thing we're not going to talk about, although myself and Sean will talk about later this afternoon, is integrating fast. So taking the next step from SharePoint 2010 into the fast space. So I'm not going to touch, there might be the odd reference to fast, but I'm not really going to touch on fast at all in this particular session. So coming on to the end user UI. The whole point of the end user UI is to provide this whole one-stop location, one-stop search center where the end user can come along, type the search terms in, albeit for content, for people, metadata, document titles, URLs, and locate everything in one place. We've enhanced the UI significantly, and we'll see it in the demo. The screenshot's not the best, with the concept of additional capabilities within scoping. So I don't know if any of you run into issues where you had extended scope rules that broke and caused a nightmare for scope compilation. We've extended that capability significantly. We've introduced the concept of refiners. So if anyone deployed the faceted search extensions that were out on Coplex for a while, and if you've got any gripes about that, talk to Sean down here, because he's one of the developers. That capability met with quite a degree of success. People liked it. It gave an additional capability to the search interface to be able to refine your content, and refine it without increasing the search or redoing the search. And then we have this concept of search federation. So search federation is something that's been there since Search Server, since the infrastructure updates, and we've extended that further to allow federation against additional sources, to extend the authentication mechanisms we can use with federation. Finally, the core search experience is improved, but we still have that core engine that says we index the documents, we collect the metadata, we collect the text out of the documents, we collect the keywords, we turn the keywords into an index, drop that on a disk, create a property store. The whole kind of thing is still fundamentally the same under the cover. But we've done some additions in terms of the look and feel. So things like pre-query and post-related query suggestions. A big phenomenon on the internet, probably a couple of years ago now, was when you started typing your search term, you got a drop-down showing all what other people might search for, what you might search for. That's now capable within the product. That's kind of out of the box with SharePoint now. The improved did you mean suggestions. So one of the, pretty much of a nightmare scenario was, you've had a fairly mature enterprise search environment. You've got a lot of content in there, a lot of content's gone through the content indexer, it's come in, it's gone out, it's been deleted, it's been removed, and your did you mean suggestions are never refined. So you might search for a term and get no results, and you'll get a suggestion that says, did you mean X, Y, Z? You click on that, and you still get no results. Okay? The problem being, we never improved the lexicon. We used a lexicon-based indexing system that used literally a text file on disk, extracted a term from there that it had seen before, thought that's what you might have been searching for, didn't really care whether the search actually terms were still in the index or not, and delivered that back to you. We've improved that significantly now, and the lexicon is still there, but it's refined every time you do a crawl. So it will never contain an item that doesn't exist in the index. You will always get something back. We have a view in browser link. If we do the online demo, we'll see that it's not, I haven't got the WAC installed or the Office web applications installed on my machine, but the view in browser link is quite nice. It fires up the interface, fires up the document, in the web-based interface, which you might have seen in other sessions anyway, and you'll certainly see in some other sessions. And then the other thing is this concept of improved query syntax, which we'll come on to later. The ability to do Boolean operations, range-based operations is all kind of out the box now. A little bit more for the end-user UI perspective, so improved relevancy. Some significant improvements in things like matching the URL. URLs where if you're searching for a term that's high up in the hierarchy of a URL namespace, it increases the relevancy. We always had that before. It used to be called URL smashing, if anyone had ever heard of that terminology before in enterprise search. And that's changed. Now look, we do it smarter, basically. Social tagging, so the concept of people. Search is social, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but adding tags to things, adding tags to people, to content, to data, to even to sites and entries and documents, all bubbles up the information in the search center. The things you tag change the way search works. It's not just based on what's in a document anymore. Click-through, significant improvements here. You click through documents, you find search results, you click on the result, makes a little entry in the database and says, someone's following this link. This is search for this, they went to here. That document's relevant to that search, so increase the rank. Skew the rank to improve that result. And we've taken a lot of rubbish out the snippets, so everyone searched for things where you saw huge big chunks of rubbish information, which I'm going to have to admit you will see in this demo, but we still see, you search for an Excel spreadsheet, for example, you get a whole raft of numbers, which don't mean an awful lot. That's improved somewhat, but we still have some issues there. Multilingual is significantly improved. So one of the major issues, and I was certainly talking to my colleagues in this Premier Support organisation, and I guess there must be some people in the room that have raised issues where when you're on sites that have multilingual capability, and you might have English written documents on a French site, or French written documents on an English site, And SharePoint just goes, oh, it's on an English site. I don't care what the language of the document is. I'm going to index it as if it's English. Okay, so you get real issues there with trying to find data and find terminology. French is probably a bad example, but Dutch, German, where you've got compound words, you get some real issues with search terminology and breaking those words up. Now we have the ability to actually take search terms out of documents, and even within a document itself. You know, if you take a Word document, you can have multi-language sections within that document. We can identify that now. We can determine that this paragraph in this document is French, and it's on an index, and it's on an English site, but we'll index it as French anyway because we understand what it's all about. We understand what the end user is trying to achieve. And then other things like the ranking, for ranking of documents in multilingual collections, because we identify the language, the source language where the document came from. When you're looking at multilingual capabilities, we allow the end user to choose the language choice. So as well, in 2007, we used to have this capability where we just went, okay, what's your browser language? That's what you're going to get. That's what we're going to default to. That is still the default, but you have the option as the end user to override it. The administrator doesn't have to intervene at all. You can just choose, I want to override this, and I want to search in these 5 different languages instead. That's all capability, and we'll try and show that in the demo. Finally, search from smartphones and desktop integration. This works. Search, if you ever looked at the mobile view we had in 2007, the kind of text-based, horrific, horrible view, we've got the same horrific, horrible view, but it has a search box as well. Okay, so you can search there. And finally, the desktop integration is really quite smart in that you can, there's a little icon on the search term. We'll see this when we look at the screen, when we look at the demo. Click the icon, brings a little OSDX file into your, onto your Windows 7 machine or Server 2008 R2 machine, and it allows you to do your desktop integrated search directly into SharePoint. So when you search on your desktop, it will federate against SharePoint and bring those results back to you as well. Really quite smart. It's nice looking. I hope it's going to work in my demo. Okay, I mentioned query syntax. So the query syntax, we've really improved this. One of the key core tenets that the search team had real questions and real RFPs about was, well, we want to do searches against phrases. We want to do search against this and not that, or this or this, or this and that. And while it kind of worked if you did free text searching or customized searching against the indexes, you couldn't really do it in the UI. It was very poor integration in the UI. We've now improved this significantly. So you've got effectively full Boolean integration. And the one that's not shown there, you can actually do near searches as well. Okay, so you can do this near this, a bit like you used to be able to do back on TechNet and MSDN back in the day. The other thing we do with wildcard, so I have big arguments about people about who needs wildcard and why do you need it. But wildcard, we allow prefix matching with wildcard, which means basically the term there, microstar will find Microsoft, microtransformer, whatever you want to search for. But we only support prefix. Okay, so you can't do anything kind of star this. It must be something star. And you can integrate the whole thing in terms of put the wildcards in wherever you like. So this could be a single search term of micro. Find everything beginning with micro where the author is Bill somebody. Okay. And then range-based as well. So you can do searches on ranges. Find me everything between certain dates. And this all works in this search box. You don't need to do customized searching for this anymore. Okay, so we just have a quick look at the demo. Hopefully it's going to fire up for me. Or not. Where's he gone? Okay. Sorry, I have no mouse space on here. So what we're going to look at is the end user interface. So as the end user approaching a site, you want to do searching. So what does it look like? What's different from a SharePoint perspective now? And apologies for the resolution. It's a bit tight on here for screen estate. So a very simple search. If we want to, I'll find a term that and I'll bring some results in. If I do a search for sales, and again, sorry about this, we get our search data. Let me just try and change the resolution. Sorry, I'll just make this a bit more compelling. I can't do it there. Let me just disconnect. Sorry about this. Extension of the video problems we had before. Just while I wait for this to connect, anyone got any questions? No? Okay. Now I'm praying this is going to reconnect. But I think I can do it down here. I think this is the same machine. Yeah, okay, so let's go back to our home page. So from a normal home page, this is the same machine. Same search box as before, same integration with things like drop-downs and scopes. We can do all the same from site settings, set up our local customized scopes, talk to a default search center, just use our local search, this site, the WSS foundation-based search capabilities. Or we can just search generally, and we find the interface. So what we see in here is a few things that have changed slightly. We've got our refiners down the left, sorry. What we don't see in this particular instance is because the search isn't bringing back a whole raft of data, normally we would get a few numbers in here talking about the actual number of items. Now, from a SharePoint perspective, we only, by default, hit the first 50 items that it retrieves from the index and give you refiners based on the first 50. When you start looking at fast, we'll talk about this later this afternoon, that ball game changes significantly. So we see a similar interface as we saw in 2007. We still have our links to our documents and data. We still have our summary. We have our final link. The one thing that you don't see in here is the preview in browser, because I haven't got the WAC installed on this machine. If we do the demo later, I'll show you that. We see federation. So down the right-hand side here, this search, the actual search that I did is going out and locating data based on information in people's profiles. So not just who people are, but what they do, what their specialities are, and we'll talk about this more when we look at the social aspects. So it's actually mining information in people's profiles. I search for sales. It's finding sales data. People are saying, what do I know about sales? And we get the same kind of interface all the way through. We still have options for alert me against search. So an alert against search is effectively saying, run this search for me again and tell me if anything changes and let me know. The RSS feed we can do against the search results as well. I'll just click on that and show you what you get there. Again, it's a standard RSS feed. You can subscribe to that in the way you would with any normal one. And this is the magic button, which I'm sure isn't going to work. Oh, that's interesting. It is going to work. This didn't work this morning. What I've done is I've clicked a button that says, do you want to include these search results in your search results on your desktop? So I'm quite pleased about that. So what my machine is going to do now is going to federate it. When I do a search, it will federate against the SharePoint site. So if I just log on, and then search. So I'll do the same search. And it's bringing back the same information. So it would find anything on my local machine, and it's finding, if you look at the URL here, it's actually going away into SharePoint and also searching against that SharePoint resource. And you can bring multiple ones of these down. Okay, so you can search against all kinds of federated locations in the desktop. Okay, the only thing we've got in here that we can add in here, so what you're not noticing here is things like sorting on relevancy, so we can turn on the web parts. If I edit the page, we can look at customizing the individual web parts themselves, which again is the same experience as 2007, which you've seen in several other demos. If this thing speeds up. Come on. And it's not playing the game. Oh, here we go. Okay. So, because I'm logged in as the wrong person, so now hopefully I've edited the page. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So if I now look at the web parts that we have in here, the key ones we want to look at are obviously the core search results one. And the core search result one shows us a lot like we saw with 2007 in that we can do customization of a whole range of things in here. For example, the location. So the location is telling me where do the search results come from for this particular core results web part. And what you'll notice in here is something we couldn't do in 2007. We can have two core results web parts on the same page, but use a different set of results for each one. In 2007, you couldn't do that. If you put two core results web parts on the same page, they were always scoped to the same set of results. And there was no way to change that because of the way the search classes were sealed, or we used a single query processor. So same as before, display properties, we can edit all the kind of things in here from a UI perspective. And I'm sure there's been a session on UI customization for search, so I'm not going to go into this in any detail. But we can change the whole thing, the look and feel. And a question we had on a session on Monday was, I want to store very large files and have them visible through SharePoint. The way you would do that is using a search result such like this and put custom XSLT in to make it look like a SharePoint. Rather than being search against a file share, look like a search against a SharePoint site. So the other keyword parts I really want to look at is the two down here. So there's the action links. And with this one, we have the ability to add in. I think I chose the right one. We can choose in here the options we want to do in terms of do we want to display the relevancy, so what view options do we want to use for searching, for sorting. And we can add in this, allow users to display the language picker, which says allow users to choose the individual languages of the different documents they're searching for. So even post-query, you can modify the result set and say refine on a certain language. Okay, so you can do it beforehand, you can do it after. And then from a slightly more interesting, I guess, from a debugging perspective, is the search statistics over here. So we'll talk about search tenants later, and one of the things that the product group had an objective to meet was sub-second query times, regardless of index, well, almost regardless of index size. And in here, we can add in additional stats, which will allow us to trace the query that's actually taking place and discover the latency or the speed that latency is actually taking, or lack of speed it may be. So we've got a little bit of information in here about how long the actual query took to actually to process. End user UI, not an awful lot more to show there. That's kind of pretty much how it is. What you can do, you can obviously do things like tagging pages and all the kind of usual social stuff you can do as well inside any normal SharePoint site. Okay.
This is better hit highlighting. What about if you follow a document to this web application? Highlight the hit.
So the question is, hit highlighting within the document? No, but you can customize it to make it do that. I've seen developers create that capability. Certainly they can do it in 7, and I've definitely seen it in 10. In fact, just 3 weeks ago at the Tech Ready conference in Seattle, I saw that. So if you email me, I'll get you the information on how to do that. Okay, so the next thing is about social search. And really this is where SharePoint wins over a lot of other search technologies. So we have this capability to really mine information and think about social networks. Anyone installed the Office Client 2010 Social Connector? Has anyone seen it? One guy, one. Anyone heard of it? Yeah? Okay, so this gives us the ability to do things like mine your emails and discover what you're talking about. Okay? Find out what the information is that you're interested in. Find out what the communication is you're having with your peers. Break the stage. And mine your instant messenger communication. So we can really find a lot of information about your interests, the topics that you're talking about, the type of information that you're discussing with your peers. And then when you go to your My Site, you will receive a pop-up box, well, not a pop-up box, but you'll get a screen that pops up and will literally say, we've discovered all these things about you. These are keywords that you're discussing. This is topics you're discussing. Would you like to add these to your profile? And it's optional. You can choose yes or no. If you choose yes, they're added to your profile. They become searchable. So just like before we found those people based on a search for the sales term, they could have been discovered by that exact same mechanism. Okay? We've changed things significantly in terms of relevancy. So the old relevancy models that we had for general SharePoint search were the same across content and people, and it was all kind of a bit of a halfway house between one or the other. So now we have this significant relevancy change for content. We've done the same for people. So SharePoint out of the box holds 8 different relevancy profiles. You can only have 2 enabled at once, one for content, one for people. But you can mix and match them with some very simple admin controls. And then the other thing we do, the chap mentioned at the front, is the metadata refinement and better hit highlighting. It's much tighter, much more integrated and much more controlled. We saw the metadata refinement piece in that we can take metadata, we can look at people properties, anything that's been published as a managed property or discoverable in a profile, we can add into metadata and refine on that. So a typical one It could be your interests and hobbies, could be your skills, could be your job role, that type of thing. We can refine on all of those. From the address book style piece, the concept of phonetic name matching. Anyone seen a demo of that? Okay, well, I really want to try and show you that then. So the ability to actually match the phonetic term. So searching for people. It's a typical example we use internally at Microsoft. We've got a product manager called Jonathan Kaufman, and his name's spelled K-A-U-F-F-M-A-N. So we try and find out any variations on his name of how you spell it and find him in the index. And there's all kinds of ways you can find him. C-O-U-G-H, C-O-F-F, it works. And I'll try and show the same thing. Nickname matching is another thing in that we can build in a custom dictionary that allows us to do things like, if I search for Michael, find Mike, find Mick, find any kind of abstraction of the name. And you can change that and customize that to suit your own purposes. There are some default ones built in for the English language only. Okay? We don't support any other languages for that, but you can obviously add your own capabilities. So in terms of what we do with search, in terms of driving the behavior, or driving the way users interact with search, when a user follows a document, I mentioned earlier about the relevancy and the click-through follow. When a user clicks a document, the relevancy changes. Users who do queries, so querying data from the search logs. So when you get query suggestions, they're coming from the search logs. They're not being kind of made up on the fly based on what you're typing. They are real terms and real things that other people have searched for. We talked about social tagging, so tagging documents, including the rating capability. So by rating documents high, by tagging things as being relevant to a certain topic or certain subject, bringing in the whole concept of the managed metadata service and using keywords and tags from that capability can increase the ranking profile. So it's all the things that end users do to improve the way people can find things. And then the final one is this concept of self-search, or what we call vanity search. So everyone must have tried it once. You've all put your own name into Google, or Bing, should I say. Or you've all searched in your own internal enterprise search engine, put your own name in just to see what's going on, what does your name bring back. Inside SharePoint, we've added in this thing called vanity searching. If you search for you, it will tell you who else is searching for you. It will tell you how many times they searched for you and what they did when they found you. So it's kind of this, how cool am I? See what people see who's looking for me. And then the concept of amplifying the impact of knowledge. So the whole concept is really to drive in, excuse the graphics, drive in this discovery about people. So encourage people to use their profiles. Profile store, most customers I go to, I look at someone's profile in the SharePoint database or SharePoint profile store, and I see a login name and I see an email address. And that's kind of a display name, and that's it. The whole concept here is to really encourage that richness of use the social store, make the best use of it, because it can really refine, really improve the way people do work. You know, you're looking for expertise and discovery, and find out what people are really doing with search. This really brings it out, brings it to the fore. I blank the names out because these are real people, although that's not their photographs. So the whole concept of improving relevancy and finding people is really where SharePoint wins. I mean, we'll mention Fast later. Fast can't do this. Okay, Fast is not good at this type of thing. And then from a delivery of social data, the My Site homepage is kind of the new thing where you're really looking at driving what's going on in the environment, what are people using, what are people discovering. The profile page is much like we had a My Site before. But the concept of tags and notes and social connector we've already talked about. So the social connector is the key thing. It's optional of what that social connector can actually do. If you do install it, you don't have to choose all the options that come with it. You can refine things and say, actually, no, I work for a company that's very private about things that we discuss in email, so I don't want that in at all. So you can really choose your own capabilities in there, in that space. And then in terms of depending on social, we really are saying in this particular scenario that you've got a corpus of information, but the corpus of information is only important when people start to use it. People find the information that's in there, consume it, find it again, someone else consumes it, rate it, tag it, do things with it. It really emboldens and really enriches the whole search experience for everybody in the organization. So it's really, really encourage and drive the way that people do this. So this capability, so SS is SharePoint Server, FS is Fast Search. So this Fast Search doesn't have this capability here. So social tags and tagging in SharePoint, Fast can't touch that stuff. Can't get anywhere near it. SharePoint is the only capability you have that can do that. Fast is extremely good at this bit, but we have from a completely social side, SharePoint's really where you want to go when you're looking at people. So we'll just look very briefly at some of the people search capabilities. So I can go back to my search center, find people. So we did a search for sales before, and sales showed a federated web part with some people in there that were relevant to sales. So I'll do the same search again. And this time what we see is the information about the people. We see highlights. This is why he's been exposed. So he's filled in his profile. He's added data about himself, and this is why we're discovering him in the sales piece. He said, ask me about sales. So ask me about is a relevance marker. If someone says, ask me about in their profile, it's actually a tag in the social profile. What they're saying is they are volunteering to be a SME or an expert in that particular area. You want to know about sales, come and ask this guy. So it's bubbled up, it's a high relevance result, and that's why he's at the top of the list. The other things that we get in terms of the browsing as colleague, browsing as organizational chart, those kinds of things are pretty much the same as before. I mentioned about the refinement from social. So we can refine down here on matches and name matches. This is information that's been pulled from the social profile. So we can see what schools people went to. We can see interests down here. And you can, as the same as you can with the SharePoint content search, you can really add as much metadata in there as you like. So as long as it's exposed in the profile as a managed property or as a crawl property to become a managed property, you can add it into this refinement panel, and the world's your oyster really in terms of finding information about people. The one thing I mentioned about the social or search for me, so if I just sign in as another user, that isn't going to work. So if I'm Dan Jump and I search for Dan Jump, I'll get this information about here, about me. So I'm seeing things like how many people have issued a search that led to me? How many keywords do I have that people are searching for that are relevant in my profile? And this is obviously a demo machine, but as things get richer and people start to use these capabilities, this whole thing really builds up and you can find some experience about who you are and what you do. And this is customizable. You can add in additional terms into here as well if you like. Again, from a search perspective, we have the same things with the Windows 7 plugin. We have the RSS, we have the alerting, so we can do the same things in here. And obviously, for the final thing will be to go to the profile. I mentioned about the Ask Me About tagging. So Ask Me About is configured in here. So if I say Ask Me About, and Dan's added these things in here to say he's relevant to these particular items, we can add notes to his notice board. Things about recent activities, so he's got nothing in this particular instance, but if he'd been tagging things, we're not going to get into the whole social scene now, but there's lots and lots of things in here you can do. And all of this information in here, in terms of his content, his organization, the tags and notes, it's all indexable. It all enriches what the end user can find about different people and different business objectives or different business activities that are taking place within your organization. Okay, so that's kind of pretty much it for social search, without going deep into the social scene. So what I want to really get on to is this bit, which is all about the actual building blocks, the bits and pieces, what's really going on with search these days. And from a SharePoint perspective, just to cover a few core pieces of terminology. I'll fire all these up, just so you can see what they all are. And these are kind of things that shouldn't be unfamiliar or completely unfamiliar. The concept of content sources, pretty much the same as before. A connection. So connections or connectors are now what we used to call protocol handlers. We still have protocol handlers, but the API for protocol handling is deprecated completely. You can still use it if you really wish, but we prefer to use .NET, use managed code, and create managed code connectors through BCS. The concept of crawling, indexing in 2007, or the connection to a content source is the crawling piece. Crawl the data, bring the data back into the product. Indexing is like the indexing pipeline. It's what you actually do with that data once it arrives. The query federation, we mentioned briefly in the federation piece before, we talked about federation to the people content sources. We can equally federate out to any source we like, either be it on the same farm, people content, or to remote farms, or to even non-SharePoint content entirely, as long as it adheres to the OpenSearch 1 or 1.1 protocol, or standards. Query servers have changed massively in 2010. The whole thing that you thought you knew about query servers in 7, just right now forget all of it, because it doesn't work that way in 2010. And then the Search Center, we've just seen the Search Center, very, very familiar experience to what we had in 7. The one thing that's majorly different is the scale out. So we can scale out enormously now, and at every single layer. So before we had this concept of... Is that like Simon Cowell pressing the big buzzer? Get off. Is that important? Do we need to leave? So should we carry on? So I'm going to carry on. So the key thing is we can scale at every level. We can scale the indexer. We're not limited to one indexer anymore. We have multiple crawlers, multiple query servers, multiple everything by one thing that we'll talk about in a minute. So how do we scale these things out? So this is mentioned about the tenants for the product group. The product group were given a directive, or asked politely, to say, we need sub-second queries at massive scale. We want 100 million items in our index, and we want you to bring our results back in less than a second. That's a huge achievement. Huge achievement. We want fresher indexes. We want you to index these things much, much quicker than you can now. We don't want to be doing a full crawl and crawling the whole thing to find out where our data is. We want better resiliency and high availability. My index server goes down. I want an automated process that's going to pick up and take care of that for me. Give me some resiliency there. So the philosophy around that was to componentize the system. So all the bits that we had before, break it all out. Take the crawler and the indexer into two separate things. Take the index partition on the query server and the query component, break it out into two separate things to give us some redundancy. Within the whole concept of the scale-out proposition is this thing called the admin service. And this, if you like, is the orchestration piece. This is the bit you don't want to lose. Okay? There is failover capability for it in terms of the database layer. And as an administrator, you can dictate which machine is hosting this service. But there is only one of them at one point in time. If this machine goes down, your search remains on. Everything's running fine, no problems at all. But you need to identify that that's gone down and just say, OK, click, this machine becomes the admin server. Or you can script it. You can automate that with PowerShell. We support mirroring for the database, as I said already, but there's no service-level redundancy out of the box. So that's the bit that you need to take care of. But in terms of how we do things...
This is security control. The alarm was activated in error. There is not an emergency situation. The Centre apologises for any disruption caused. All staff stand down and return to normal duties.
Is that going to be on my video? Yes. Okay. So we can change the admin service, but only we can change it through the UI if it's online. We can change it through PowerShell if it's not. So nice and simple. So what's actually in here? From the crawler component perspective, we mentioned about this concept of indexing. Indexing in 2007 was probably the biggest question we ever had. Why can I only have one indexer? And if I have another one, why can't I use it? Why does it have to become a hot spare and we just plug it in if we need it and then we have to recrawl everything and it becomes a whole administrative nightmare? What we've done in here is we've changed it significantly that crawl is now dependent on two things. So what used to be the search database is now split into 3 databases. There's the property store, there's the crawl store or the crawl DB, and there's the admin service DB. From a crawling perspective, we have a crawl DB. This is containing everything like the URL history, what we are crawling, what the crawl queue is. When you issue a full crawl, there's a table in this database that fills up with URLs. And then the crawlers go and pick those up and say, I'll index this one, you index that one, you index this one. And these crawler components sit on a single machine at this level of scale. You can have more than one crawler component per machine. If you have more than one crawler component talking to a single database, you have resiliency. If this crawler component fails, this one will pick up the load and carry on. Okay, it's on the same physical machine though. So what happens if the physical machine fails? Well, if the physical machine fails, we go one step further. We have another crawl database. We have another crawl server. These can crawl generally crawl different content, but you can, because of multiple crawlers, in this particular scenario, we've said we've got one crawler on one physical server, one crawler on another. So we've introduced physical failover here at this level. If either of those physical machines fail, crawl carries on as before. If either of those crawl components fail, crawl carries on as before. You have to lose the whole lot before you lose everything. Okay, so it's a significant, huge change. And we can go even further than that. So we can really go huge. It's as big as you like. There is no limit. This crawler DB, typical in SharePoint, we say, well, you can only have so many of those, 16 of them, 10 of these. There is no limit on those. Okay, so you want to go large, you go as large as you like. Crawler, in terms of scale out, the more crawlers you have, the faster you can index. So index freshness. Keep things nice and quick and moving nice and fast. It also means, and a particular problem I had was with a customer in Norway, they had a huge infrastructure, they had one index server, they had a really slow content source, and a lot of really fast ones. When that slow one was indexing, all those fast ones had to sit and wait. That's gone away. Because we have this thing called content distribution rules, which means I can say, this crawler, in this crawl database, will crawl these hosts. These are the slow ones, so I'll let you get on with that, while all these other ones index all the fast stuff. Keep it nice and quick and fresh. So it's really, really a huge scale-out proposition. From what we have in there, so the key things to think about, crawlers allow per physical server. You can have as many as you like, as long as you can physically run them. That's the key thing. We can associate multiple crawlers to a crawl DB for resilience, as you saw in the diagram, and they support mirroring. So your crawl database is mirror aware. You can mirror it with SQL, and it'll just fail over if required. A few recommendations in here. So we're talking about optimize the speed. So index freshness, we've talked about that just very briefly. The more you have, the faster things go. The key thing here, any SAN vendors in the room? No. Anyone got really fast disks? Because you're going to need them. 7,000 IOPS on a crawl DB. That's a significantly huge amount of disk I/O. You're going to need those kind of levels in a very large enterprise. This is measured off MSIT, where we've got 150 million items in the index, and we're crawling globally. But those kind of numbers, 3.5K is what we're asking for minimum. That's a lot of physical spindles on a disk. Your SAN vendors are going to struggle to give you that, really, unless they dedicate an entire SAN to you. But it's not a requirement, okay? That's just if you want to go really fast. And then this concept of host distribution rules that I mentioned, as well as having the fast and slow host scenario, with the host distribution rule, where we have a scenario where we're paying a lot of money for a custom indexing connector, maybe to Documentum, because that's a free one now, but maybe you've got a really custom storage archiving solution, and the vendor for that is saying, well, you can index this, I'll build you a connector, you can buy it off me and index your storage solution, but we're going to charge you $100,000 for it. You can say, well, that's fine, because I only want one, because I'll just put it on one of my crawl DBs. The other ones don't need it. They'll just get on with everything else. Whereas in 2007, it had to be everywhere. You needed it all over the place. So what's changed at the query level then? Query level, very similar to before in terms of what's in the index. What's very different is how we break the index up. So we still have the concept of one huge, what we call a triply catalog, an inverted index. But we break it into segments. They're not individual small indexes, it's one big index that's been chopped up. So in this particular scenario here, we have two index partitions. So partition A, partition B, they are half of the index each. In this scenario, we've spread it across two machines. So we have a query component on this machine that is serving this index partition here. Query component, if you can't, I don't know if you can see that, but that says BM, so it's B mirror. And we're mirroring this one over here. So there's two copies of the same thing there. And this gets quite complex. If you want to talk, I'll talk about this till the cows come home. But what we're effectively saying is we can split the index in half. We can offer multiple query components that can read the same copies of the index, or a mirrored copy of the index, and provide search terms against it. So in this particular scenario, if a user issued an end user issued a query here, it would hit all four of those query components, and the fastest one of A that responded and the fastest one of B that responded would deliver half of the data from this index, and this is kind of weird, it's wrapped round, and you get half of it from there. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, I'm free most of the afternoon. We'll come and talk about it. The scalability is huge. So we're saying in each of these individual index partitions, maximum of about 8 to 10 million items. Okay? In your typical scenario, that particular scenario there would reflect very similar to a 2007 environment, where you would have potentially a full copy of the index on each machine. So you propagate into both machines, and you have full copy of the index on each. In this case, what we're saying is you don't need that. You can split it in half, and then you have a query component that talks to half each. There's a lot of blank faces. If you really want to talk about this, we'll talk about it for a long time. But just to show you how it scales, we can go in further. So this particular one is saying multiple query components, multiple index partitions, multiple databases, multiple property stores. And again, there ain't no limit. You keep these things going. You keep it going as big as you like. Okay? Property stores stores the metadata, the managed properties that we index in Search in 2007, but it's just the property store. So when we're propagating in this scenario, the index server, and something I didn't mention earlier, which is really important, the index server doesn't store a copy of the index anymore. So when you're doing your planning and capacity planning for search, the index server doesn't need a full copy. It doesn't need that 2.85 times file multiplier times whatever, 500 gig local disk. That's gone. It only needs enough to store a shadow copy. Typically, 1-2 gig disk is ample. That's all it's going to need before it can send the data out. The index server will send the data out. It will send it to here. It will send it to here. Send it to all the index partitions. There's a whole calculation piece that goes on in the background that's way too deep for this session. But effectively what we're saying is because these query components are small, we're smashing the query components out into smaller pieces, or query indexes into smaller pieces, but running more processes against them. So I can have a query component that says, I'm going to hit this query index that's got a fifth of my index in it, and the next one says I'm going to hit the other fifth. Because it's only a fifth in size, I can potentially store the whole thing in memory, and it becomes a really fast operation. You're searching much smaller files. You can even go one step further than this and push the query component such that you have 2 query components for A on the same machine. And therefore, you're going even one step further and running 2 processes against 2 copies of the index, so you're potentially spinning up twice as fast, twice as many threads. Okay, so it's a huge area to get into. And then on top of that, we can have failover. So while we can have a copy of our mirror that's active, we index against it, we query against it, we can also have a copy that's inactive. So this is taking the one we had before, where all the components are active. We're now saying, well, I'm fast enough without having all those active ones. I'm going to have an inactive one. So what happens here is this is inactive. It's receiving updates, but it's never being crawled. So this machine is never having to serve resources to keep this one in memory. When query component B, if that was to fall over and fail, the admin service would detect that and inform query component B mirror to come online. And that would come online with a copy of the index, and it would carry on as before. And it's literally a less than a minute operation to do that. Okay, lots of blank looks. Any questions right now? Or inundate me later. I'm quite happy to take this online. So the whole thing, the way it works, we have multiple index partitions, multiple query components. Each query component holds a piece of the index. Okay, the smaller the piece of the index, the faster you can query it. The more query components you have with the same copy of that index, the faster you can get results back. Because potentially one can be busy while one's not, and vice versa. Each one requires an index partition, which we saw in the diagram. We can have active or failover. Again, we saw that in the diagram. And we support about 10 million items and 25 million items per property database. So we saw the property database, index partition is associated to a property database, and we can have about 25 million items in there. And we all support mirroring across the board. And what we're saying, there's a few recommendations here. On Friday, when the product RTM'd, we actually released a huge raft of search documentation about capacity planning, about guidance, big diagrams and TechNet posters about all this kind of stuff. It's really informative. I would definitely suggest you download that content or email me, and I can either email it to you or tell you where to find it. So a couple of points on scale out. Index freshness and crawl times. Really looking at keeping things happy and keeping things fast. The more components you have, the faster things go. Latency and throughput, I'm not going to read all this, but if you want to make queries times shorter, you want more index partitions and potentially more query components. All depends on where you find the bottleneck. And then from availability for both, we can have redundancy at all layers. So there's no issue now if your indexer fails over, because the whole thing is by default configured to pick up the pieces and keep moving. Okay. Content distribution, I mentioned already about this in terms of the distribution to the way crawling works. So if you've got 2 crawlers talking to the same crawl DB, they'll just share URLs. So there'll be the table will fill up, and they'll just pick one each and index it down the line, and then discard them as it happens, as it completes. This is the concept of host distribution rules as well. From a query distribution perspective, keep your index partitions small and the same size. They will automatically be the same size by default because we build them based on a hash of the doc ID. So if there's 100 docs and 2 query partitions, you're automatically going to get 15 each. You can't change that. But except if you have small disks. It will detect if disks are small, and it will manage the partitions accordingly. So just be wary of that one. Okay, so I mentioned about the resiliency of this scenario. So the 2007 style mirroring is true that we still mirror out our partitions. We still have that capability. But we can have multiple crawlers now. So crawler downtime is gone away completely. I mentioned already in SQL mirroring, we've already mentioned. A few other bits and pieces. So in terms of the administration of search, crawl rules, so where you configure a rule that says crawl this URL but use a different account, or crawl this URL and exclude certain subsections of that site, we can use regular expressions in there now. So you can get some really quite complex and quite refined crawl rules. We natively support case-sensitive repositories, but in 2007, case sensitivity was a patch that we released. It came before infrastructure updates and then was included in that. And it was an all-or-nothing thing. You were either case-sensitive or you weren't. Now we can do case sensitivity on a URL by URL basis. And we can prioritize content sources. So we can say, if you've got a small environment with only 2 crawlers, so you could potentially have a bottleneck in there with speed, we can say, this content source has priority. So if this content source starts to be indexed and this one hasn't finished, this is higher priority than this one, stop that one or pause that one, and this one moves in and takes over and indexes ahead of it. And then finally, the thing about low indexing downtime for search backups, I've got a slide on that later, but we can do search backup now significantly faster than we could before. And there's a slide that, some of the later slides in this deck are really for reference, but they're there for, we'll see that later. The other thing I mentioned about the connector framework, so protocol handlers are deprecated, or the protocol handler API is deprecated, should I say. So we crawl very differently now in that we still use the concept of SPS3 or HTTP for hitting websites and SharePoint sites. But if we're hitting BDC, for example, hitting backend data sources, we can now do entity association. So if there's an item in a database, with BDC search previously, if there was a blob in that database, you couldn't index it. Now we can. We can pull the blob out and index the blob as well as all the data in the table. We can also follow associations. So documents that have links in them to other documents will follow that link, even inside BDC data. So if there's a table that has a link to another table, we'll follow the link and pick out that data as well. So it's full end-to-end. And then finally, the thing about caching and batching, one of the things that BDC was notoriously bad for when you were indexing through BDC was pulling one item at a time out the database. So it was like query all the time. Now we'll take a huge batch query and take a whole load of data out, index it, and then go and get some more. So it's just a single query, a bigger data set, but that's less important than number of queries in terms of performance. And then with the crawl options that we have, we can do regular full crawl, same as 2007. We can do all these options in terms of timestamp. So if you have a remote source that can say, you can define a column in a remote source as being time-based column, you can use that as the criteria for are we doing indexing against it. Do we need to index it now? Rather than in the old BDC days, it would just index it anyway. We can now say, check the time first. And then finally in here, the changelog capability, we can do things like look at the Exchange. If you do an Exchange public folder crawling, we can look at the delete log in the Exchange folder and say, actually, just delete all this stuff now. Don't bother trying to crawl it, and if you don't find it, delete it. Just hit that log and delete it now. It's gone. We don't need it anymore. In terms of the connector architecture, I keep this quite simple. We have very straight scenario with end user searching. Users at the results page. If you're crawling through BDC connectors, you go to the BDC profile. Everyone knows BDC profile pages from 2007? Yeah, everyone's comfortable with that idea. So BDC profile pages that expose the data. We still crawl through those. We can still crawl through those. Or you can go straight through the BDC runtime and hit directly into WCF, into databases, custom .NET shims, even custom shim that's not managed code. You can put your own shim in there, whatever you like, as long as it's going to retrieve data and bring the data back in the right format that SharePoint can index. We'll be quite happy with that. So the whole BDC BCS capability is extremely powerful for indexing custom repositories. And that's really where this comes in. But like I say, we still have protocol handlers. So if you scroll in the web, if you're crawling SharePoint, you're still going to see your HTTP and your STS and your SPS protocol handlers in there. Think about the deployment. So one of the aspects of this particular session was to talk about the deployment and how easy it is, and it really is so easy. In terms of configuring, everyone installed Beta or RC, or no one's not installed the product, right? So very straightforward. Do the prerequisites, run the setup tool, do the post setup piece. Very similar to 2007 at this point. I wouldn't do that. Don't do the config wizard. You can if you're doing a simple installation. Preference, do it manually. Do it manually, you have more control. Do it through the wizard, it kind of takes over and does all kinds of random stuff. But I wouldn't use the wizard for doing most stuff. And then finally, you end up with a search dashboard. So from the search perspective, when you enable the search, you can't control the names of the databases. So you're automatically going to get 3 databases with a hideous script with GUID on the end. When you add new crawler components or add new property DBs, you can change those names. And you can go back and change the GUID-based ones later as well. So in terms of the things you can do with this piece here, don't use the wizard. So for manageability, we've seen we're going to look at the consolidated admin UI. Can someone tell me what we're doing for time, Sean? About 10 minutes. Okay, no, not that. Okay, so from a manageability perspective, we've got the administration UI. We can do manage accounts. So if you're in the session on Monday, we talked about manage accounts. You can have managed accounts for all your search services, so you define them up front. You can use them for crawling. You can use them for the search service itself. We do full PowerShell support for search. Everything inside search can be done with PowerShell, so you can script it. There's no reason to use the UI at all if you don't really want to. And all of the health monitoring, all of the integration, all of the alerts that are generated with search are bubbled up through SCOM as well. And the final thing that we're not really going to look at is, because there's no data in the machines, is the search analytics. Search analytics is extremely powerful. Search analytics will tell you, my queries are taking too long. I'm spending too long in full text indexing on my crawlers. It's time to add more crawlers and speed this whole thing up. It's time to add more crawl databases to improve my performance. And the metrics are there and defined for you in terms of what's happening. You get some really nice graphs. You can see each individual step of the content processing pipeline and what's taking the most time, and make the right decisions accordingly to adjust your infrastructure. From a backup perspective, I mentioned we improve this significantly. So we do backup in 2 phases. We try and keep indexing online during backup. So phase 1 is very straightforward. We stop the indexing from actually happening. Crawling still occurs, but we're stopping indexing. So we're still crawling, we're still grabbing data, but we're not actually pushing that data into our indexes. And we index the whole thing. We copy the index itself, and we back up the search databases at that point. So it's like a snapshot of the, not a SQL snapshot, but it's a snapshot of the databases and the indexes themselves. We then stop the crawler. So at the point we stop the crawler, indexing is actually stopped. But what it means is all the changes that came in while the crawlers were still crawling and you were backing up everything else, we then pick up the diff. So we pick up the whole thing at that point. And at that point, search is still online. So you've no scenario where searching is actually dead while you're backing it up, whereas if you use like DPM or use some of the other products where you may have to stop search completely to be able to back it up. And then we continue the whole thing. Once we've completed the backup, we start the whole thing running again. So it's very slick, very granular. And this is the SharePoint UI that does this. DPM 2010 cannot do this. Okay? For DPM, you're looking at SQL workloads only. In terms of restore, so two scenarios for restore. Do we want to restore over what we already have, or do we want to restore into a new search application? And we can do either. If we restore over what we already have, basically what happens is what you already have is deprovisioned, and the new stuff is written back on top. So we recreate the services, drop the indexes down, restore the databases back, and restart the whole thing. If you're doing a restore from an older version, we'll upgrade it as well. You could not do that in 7. If you tried to restore an SSP from a previous version, if you could ever restore an SSP at all, then, sorry, very cynical, then you would have a real problem because the SSP was out of sync, it was a wrong version, you couldn't use it. The scenario here is if you restore the search service, shared service application, because it's an application in its own right, we can look at that and say, this is an earlier version, we need to upgrade it to match the version of the farm, and it runs the upgrade scenario that we have that I think there's a session on later on this afternoon or tomorrow on upgrade. So it does a regular in-place upgrade of the databases. And if you're restoring to a new one, basically what happens is your existing one continues to work. We can have as many search service applications in the farm as we like. We just create a new one alongside the existing one, and it just restores down. Okay, and that's kind of the way it works. You'll get the indexes restored. So indexes will be restored onto servers that are running the service SharePoint query and site setting service. So depending on where the services are in the farm, that's where the indexes will get laid down. And the components themselves, you have to associate them back to those individual indexes. And then basically crawls and merges carry on. And if it's a previous build of the farm, you'll get an upgrade. Okay, nice and simple. So just to show you what the admin looks like. Very, very briefly on this. In terms of the central administration, tell me if it doesn't come up, because I can't see anything. I'll try and navigate to it, see if it'll let me in. So while that's running, let me see if oh, great. Okay, so from a central admin perspective, when you're administrating search, just as unlike 2007, we don't have this concept of an SSP, which you've seen probably in every demo you've seen so far. Instead, we go to our application management, and we look at our managing our service applications. And inside here, we have a service application called Search. And when we manage it, what you see is initially a very similar UI to what you saw post-infrastructure update in 2007. So down the left-hand side, we have our content sources, crawl rules, crawl log, same kind of things in here. A little bit more information in here than you have with the infrastructure updates. Some nice stuff, some stuff that's telling you kind of what's going on in the farm, what propagation's occurring, all the kind of things here. So this is obviously idle. Propagation's always idle if you're not actually crawling. We get our history of our crawl logs down here, and we get this final thing down the bottom called Topology Manager. So down here we can see the administrative component, which is the server that's hosting the admin service. We get our crawl component. So in this case, it's a single server. So I've got one crawl component. I could have more running on the SP2010 box. Databases, I have 3. So I have my administrative database, I have my crawl database, which is the search orchestration database, and I have my property database, which is the metadata, the managed properties, the discovered properties that we have, or that we retrieve from the actual indexing itself. And then finally, at the bottom, I have my query component. So my query component is the piece that checks the content index on disk and returns the results back to the web front end. And we can modify these very, very simply. So if you're in the administrator in here, you can choose to add new ones, crawl components, crawl database, index partition. You can't have a query component without an index to associate it with, and obviously a property database. The other thing we can do once we're down here is if I decided I wanted to have a copy of this, sorry, not a copy of that, where's it gone? Copy of this. I can add in here, for example, add a mirror of this one and set it to be a failover mirror. And it's as simple as tick the box, click OK. SharePoint takes care of the rest. It will take a copy of the index off one machine or on the same machine and copy it to a different file location. And it does it from machine to machine. It doesn't have to wait for the indexer to start churning and fill that thing up. It's an it's a simple SMB file copy. And as soon as it's available, it comes online. There's nothing else for the admin to do in that point.
How is the best practices advice changed with respect to creating databases via the UI?
Okay. So the question was, how has the best practices changed with creating databases via the UI? You can create the databases through, let the SQL DBAs do it themselves if you wish, but you could do it through the UI if you wanted to. If you do it through the UI, you still have that same issue of, well, my SQL growth properties and all that kind of stuff that might not be quite how you want it in the real world. But you can equally create an empty database in SQL and just name it when you create a new database in here, and it'll just pick it up and run with it. And that's what I would always prefer to go down that route. So where was I? And it's horrible to get back to. So in terms of just one of the other things in here, so we looked at other things like crawler impact rules. The concept of the analytical reports are in here, and the usual things you see in terms of crawler impact, index reset, the things you saw in 2007. The one thing that's in here is slightly different is host distribution rules. I'll click it, it's going to complain. So it's complaining because I only have one crawl database. If I had more than one crawl database, it would give me the option to sync into two and say, this crawl database is going to run these URLs, this crawl database can run the other URLs. So it gives us that flexibility to distribute where our content's going to go. Okay. Apart from that, it's generally create content source, what type is it, is it a file type, is it a web type, is it a SharePoint type? That's the same operations you've seen time and again with 2007. Where's my clicker? So with that, just a quick summary. I didn't touch on planning because I recognise we really wouldn't have time. But we've done the evolution piece a little bit. We talked about federation, search features, goals of the team, scale out redundancy. This, for me, is where things have changed immensely. You know, I'm an IT pro, hardcore IT pro. I'm interested in making sure things don't fail, things perform, things operate normally. If the users are happy, that's kind of all right with me. I don't really nice. If it looks nice, I don't care. But as long as I can back it up and restore it and make it operate properly, that fits my end goal. So we've seen these things. We've seen deployment and manageability to a degree. I didn't want to do the concept of create a new search application because it just would have sat there forever while I did it. But with that, I think we're done. So don't know if I ran over or slightly short, but any other Q&A? If you've got Q&A on indexing and query partitions, then we'll go and find have a coffee somewhere. Thank you.